Silence makes us uncomfortable. There's a common colloquial term for this, an awkward silence. Something about silence tends to not sit well with us. And I guess it makes sense because silence isn't something we experience very often in our life. Our lives are a constant barrage of videos and music and ringtones and reminder bells and notification pings, and that's just the noise that comes from our smartphones. We're so accustomed to the sound of cars driving by, or planes flying overhead, or having some sort of TV or music playing in the background, that when we actually have to be present in a silent space, it often leaves us feeling completely uncomfortable, as if we're strangers visiting some sort of foreign land. The reality is, many people don't really like the spiritual practice that I've chosen to share with you today because it deals mainly with silence. And truth be told, I didn't really like it at first either. For this sermon series on spiritual practices, I chose to speak about centering prayer because once I really gave it a chance, it became a transformative practice in my life. It's changed how I think about God, how I think about myself, and how I approach my life each day. That's a good spiritual practice right there. Centering prayer is a form of prayer with roots all the way back to the contemplative desert fathers of the 4th century. And in this contemplative practice, there are no words to memorize, no process to remember. All you do is get comfortable and close your eyes and sit in silence, usually for 20 straight minutes. As you might imagine, for someone like me, who can't sit still and often talks too fast, centering prayer didn't seem like a very good fit at first. I'd get bored, I'd get uncomfortable, I'd want to get out of my seat and run around. All I could think about was, when will this time be over? That's how I felt back in 2004 when a retreat leader first introduced me to centering prayer. I was young at the time, and so I didn't see any wisdom or value in slowing down and letting go. I was much too focused on doing and achieving and accomplishing as much as I could. But about 10 years later, after that, centering prayer crossed my path again, and at this point in my life, I was tired and a little beaten down. I'd been a pastor for about 3 years at that point in time, and I had 2 young children at home, and I was really struggling as I adjusted to this new phase of my life. I was learning that accomplishing all my lofty goals as a pastor was really hard because the church was made up of people with all sorts of different ideas than me. And so I'd spend hours strategizing and researching and trying to figure out how to move my struggling congregation from point A to point B. And then I'd go home and have 1,000 things to do for my toddler daughter and my infant son. And I was exhausted, and if I'm being really honest, I was pretty sad at that point in time as well. It was during this season of my life that I encountered centering prayer for a second time. And this time, I was able to see that this approach to prayer spoke to and cared for my soul in a way that I deeply needed. Because it was silent. It wasn't caring for a crying infant or a talkative toddler. It wasn't a complaining parishioner or a long-winded explanation. It wasn't another thing I had to do. In fact, it was the opposite of that. Centering prayer is simply taking time to cease all our striving and to rest in the love and presence of God. It's amazing what you encounter during these silent moments, when you're just listening and waiting for God to speak. At first, it just seems so foolish and unproductive. We expect God to move through these big, grand gestures and powerful, awe-inspiring moments. And God can do that. But what I've learned is that sometimes God's ways are much more quiet and unexpected. We heard this in that Old Testament reading that Sylvia read for us. The prophet Elijah is running for his life, and he hides out in a cave. And he's scared and exhausted, and in this moment, Elijah prays to God, who instructs him to go to the mouth of the cave because God is about to pass by. And at first, there are all these dramatic moments that we would expect to be the presence of God. There's wind and an earthquake and fire, but God is not in those spaces. Finally, we're told there's the sound of sheer silence. And from out of the silence, God finally speaks to Elijah. Centering prayer is a practice that plays off this wisdom from Scripture. Centering prayer invites us to see the silence not as something that we should avoid or cover up, but rather as the very place where God has been waiting for us. In centering prayer, we enter the silence, the vast, expansive silence of an ordinary moment. And in these empty, open spaces, we discover that God is already right there with us now. We've just been too distracted by all the noise to really recognize it. There are moments all throughout Scripture where it talks about the fear of the Lord. And there are stories of people who seem to be completely undone when they find themselves in the presence of God. And it makes me wonder if this is what's happening to us when we first sit with the silence. Are we so uncomfortable being still or being bored or being in the silence? Because those moments are actually times when we're face to face with God. When we have to be silent and still, it inherently forces us to notice all our flawed logic, all our mistakes, all the parts of ourselves that we don't really like, that we've been desperately trying to cover up and ignore. And so at first we hate it. We can't stand the silence because we're afraid of how God works on us in that space. We're afraid of having to sit and allow God to unmask all of our lies. That's definitely why I hated centering prayer at first. I didn't want to see that I was always trying to get people to like me. I didn't want God to show me how insecure and scared I really was. I hated centering prayer at first, but by continuing to return to a space of silence, God began to show me that all my words and attempts to try and figure everything out and come across as really impressive weren't what mattered to God. As a pastor, my life at that time was filled with sermons and prayers and Bible studies and words upon words upon words about God. But in centering prayer, you don't say words. You don't even silently think a prayer in your head. You just sit in the presence of God and let everything go. It's a practice that inherently moves us from our head space to our heart space, because there are no words. I remember after a few years of practicing centering prayer regularly, I had this image come into my head one day when I was praying. I was picturing my 2-year-old son running towards me to give me a huge hug, as he often did at that point in his life. And I found myself thinking about how those moments filled my heart with such love. But then during my time of prayer, God redirected me a little bit. God invited me to see that moment differently. God said, "Nate, you are the running child, and I am the parent giving you the hug." This is what centering prayer or any other spiritual practice does for us. They help us see that we're children in the arms of a loving God. The spiritual practice doesn't earn us this love. No, God is waiting for us in every moment of every day. And the practices just help tune our hearts and minds towards this God who's always waiting to embrace us. I'm really compelled by the idea presented in the story of Elijah. This idea that silence is a space where God is at work. Think about it. That means that God communicates in a way that's beyond words. It means that slowing down and doing less and letting go are the very paths towards encountering this God. Silence and stillness encourage us to discover that God's love never depended on what we can do or how hard we work. Rather, God's love and grace are ever-present realities that we simply relax into. But perhaps the reason why I'm most compelled by this idea of God's being present in the silence is because silence is how every life ends. As we heard in the gospel passage, Jesus cried out from the cross. He felt forsaken and forgotten by God. And those were his last words before he took his final breath. Jesus, whose words inspired and healed and changed the world, stopped speaking and gave up his life. But as Christians, we believe that through his death, Jesus sanctified that awful, tragic moment when humans become silent for their final time. Through his death, Jesus assured us that the silence that comes when we breathe our last is nothing for us to be afraid of. It's actually just another silent moment where God is waiting for us.